It's Bond here, again for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. Tonight we have a topic that I wanted to cover for some time now because we all have mentioned it on numerous occasions throughout our episodes, and we were thinking it might be a good idea to actually cover the incident itself. Now, as we've said many times, we are not a Pennsylvania-centric podcast, but we are very Pennsylvania-centric people.
But we do have our own other podcast, which is exclusively Pennsylvania. So we get that out.
So
it's not here.
Exactly. Yeah, we try to get that out. And I know it seems like we're doing a lot of PA-centric stuff right now, and we probably will for the time being, only because we're trying to get to places and everything. And honestly, like, we have access to this stuff a little easier than going out to check out things other places that we'd absolutely love to go to, but just, kind of can't do the traveling right now. So for our non-PA based listeners, I hope this stuff is still of equal interest. Now, the incident we're talking about took place December 9th, 1965, at what I have is 4:47 p.m. And what we're referring to is the Kecksburg UFO Incident. I choose those words very wisely when I say UFO incident because there is lots of speculation, both at the time, directly after, and in the history since, as far as what actually happened there. Kecksburg, if you're not familiar with it, is about 40 miles east of Pittsburgh in Westmoreland County, which is right in the Chestnut Ridge area. So for those of you that follow Stan Gordon, if you follow the folks over at Small Town Monsters, anything regional to Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio, you've probably heard of at the very least, the Chestnut Ridge region.
And you really can't talk about this without mentioning Stan Gordon. It's kind of his beginnings.
Yes, that's kind of what I wanted to get that out here first. Is I did have a few sources for what I'm going to talk about today. One of the main sources is Stan Gordon. I have some research here from Penn State from Matthew Dinkle. Additionally, I went through a few articles written by Leslie Keene, one written by J. Allen Hynek, who a lot of UFO buffs will be familiar with. So lots of people have written on it, but Stan Gordon is kind of the main guy because him being based around Greensburg, this was in his backyard and kind of spurred his interest in the paranormal and the unknown, and has led to a very long career for him taking in cases and reports. So whenever we reference Stan Gordon, he's kind of like the godfather of the paranormal in this area, especially along the Chestnut Ridge. And I've never had the pleasure of actually meeting him, but based on all the interviews I've seen and a few people I've talked to that have met him, he seems like just also a very stand-up guy.
My dad and his wife have met him a few times at different things, and not paranormal related, but they say he's a fairly nice guy.
Exactly. So whenever we talk about Stan, that is the Stan that we are in fact talking about. So anyway, on that evening, 4:47, so late afternoon, early evening, depending on what time you eat dinner, what happened that day was something fell from the sky. You had it reported all the way from Ontario across Indiana into Ohio of people seeing what they called a fireball streaking through the sky. People reported sonic booms, things of that nature. With me saying, streaking through the sky and falling, there are some people who say that once it got close to the ground near Kecksburg, people who report seeing it make controlled movements, which would imply that it was still a crash, but maybe a controlled crash. And this is where you get some of the first inklings that this may have been either man or man-made device, not the obvious meteorite. So regardless of how it fell, it definitely fell. And the object ended up landing or crashing right near the fire station in Kecksburg in a little hollow over one of the hills. Whenever this first happened, the early eyewitnesses said that initially there was blue smoke rising from the site, but that quickly dissipated, suggested to early onlookers that there was not a fire. It came in hot enough that it did take off the tops of some trees. Now, very quickly, you have the state police and the fire department roping off the area. Civilians and reporters who were kept out watched from a nearby road. From what I can find, we're talking possibly, maybe not 100 people, but at least dozens of people watched from the kind of road nearby, seeing what was going on. Now, within a few hours, you do have the military arriving, and they definitely took something away on a flatbed truck. And that's kind of like all people, initially saw. Now, witnesses, some people say they saw Army, some people say they saw Air Force, and even some people claim to have seen NASA personnel on site very quickly. Now, the next day, papers reported the incident. Officially, nothing was recovered, though. All the papers say that something crashed, but do not have any indication from any official government body what was recovered, if anything was. A lot of papers immediately speculated that it was a meteorite. That being said, there were some folks who got close to the craft or object early, before the police even got there. Partly out of curiosity, partly also probably to make sure that there wasn't anyone injured. Because again, we're not at this place, we're not that far from a few airports. So, a plane coming down wouldn't be the craziest thing. A few of the folks who got close early say what they saw was a large acorn-shaped object. It was a bronze yellow color and tall enough probably for a person to stand in. They reported no seams on it, so it didn't appear to be like riveted together like a lot of the steel that people would be familiar with in the area. And there was strange lettering on the craft. Now, one of the longtime residents and early people to go on the record from seeing this close up was a gentleman named Jim Romansky, who was a local machinist. Another who was nearby, who showed up right away, was a gentleman named John Murphy, who was the director of the local radio station in Greensburg. So these are two people who, are locals, are known to people, have ties to the community, aren't just random folks. We know who these people are. They were two of the people that were there right away. Additionally, some of the other folks that we know that were there early was Stan Gordon, who we mentioned earlier, spoke to someone who was ex-military who worked at Lockheed Air Force near Columbus, who said that was where the object was originally taken. And then it went on to Wright-Patterson. People, again, UFO buffs know Wright-Patterson as the possible home of the Roswell crash. So that's basically what happened the initial night. This thing came down. People weren't sure what it was. You had military, possibly military and Air Force, maybe even NASA showing up quickly and getting people out of the area, which is, understandable, because whatever it was, it probably needed to be, secured in some fashion. But you do have people reporting that the military who did show up was very, very forceful about keeping people away, even going to the point of telling people to get away at gunpoint, which, if this was a meteorite, seems like a little bit of overkill. And I think the secrecy initially is what got people originally thinking like, maybe there is something more to this. So things start swirling around, and this turns into, what people refer to as Pennsylvania's Roswell. Now, as far as some of the documentation that came out in later years, and I know Nick's going to give us some stuff that has happened much more recently, Project Blue Book actually had a few documents on Kecksburg. And for those of you that aren't aware, again, we should probably do a whole episode on Blue Book at some point, but it's basically the government's first major look into UFOs as a credible threat. Now, Blue Book came across a document which stated, a call was made to the Oakdale radar site in Pennsylvania. A 3-man team had been dispatched to Acme, which some residents in Kecksburg may have Acme addresses. It's an adjacent municipality, to investigate and pick up an object that started a fire. Now, the other documents they found didn't reference what fell from the sky, but the documents showed other agencies like the Air Force and Navy showing interest in whatever was found. So this coming out in the late 60s, early 70s ended up really fueling a lot of the conspiracy theory ideas, as far as like, well, they said nothing was found, and here we have government documents saying that something was in fact found. So as far as early folks looking into this at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, you have people saying that it could have been a meteorite, obviously. That's kind of like the Occam's razor, right? However, would a meteorite garner that type of response, is what a lot of people said early on. There is the other idea that it could have been a manned spacecraft, whether US or not. Now, the interesting thing about that, and Russia specifically said that one of their Venus probes, Cosmos 96, had re-entered Canada the same day, but at a different time, and was recovered. So
I will be getting into that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. At least initially doesn't seem like it was a Russian craft. Then other people say it could have been a straight up UFO, whether, however you want to describe that. Then going back to our buddy Stan Gordon, which book is it in? It's either in Secret Invasion or it's in Astonishing Encounters. Can't remember which one I found it in. But Stan did speak with 3 men who were ex-Air Force, who 2 on the record said that it was an extraterrestrial craft, 1 saying that it was a Russian craft. And I believe that would have been back in the 90s. And one of the other things that fueled a lot of the Russian part of this talk was whenever those initial witnesses tried to recreate the lettering that they saw on it, a lot of people said it looked like hieroglyphics. What a lot of other people said is they said it looked like Cyrillic writing, which is the Soviet alphabet. So that's kind of like the real quick overview of what happened initially in Kecksburg in 1965 and the years after. Now, some of the things that have kind of kept this in the zeitgeist, I think, are 3 things. 1, it's definitely a celebrated fact here, at least in Western Pennsylvania. Kecksburg itself has a UFO/Heritage Festival every year, which apparently I've never been to. I'd like to go to, but like to go to it some year. But what I found online seems like it draws thousands of people whenever they have it. So, and Kecksburg is definitely not a town of thousands of people. So people do show up for it, and people are interested in it. There was a Unsolved Mysteries episode, I believe in season 1, the Kecksburg crash. So obviously that kind of in the 90s brought it to a new audience all over the country. Just for myself, I've actually finally checked Kecksburg off of my UFO or just paranormal hotspot bucket list. Me and my brother actually visited there recently and kind of poked around a little bit and got to see near the fire station, they actually have a replica of the craft. It's up on the hill. It's all lit up and everything. It's pretty cool.
That replica actually was created for that Unsolved Mysteries episode, coincidentally.
Yes. And so the town definitely, they definitely lean into it. But yeah, so that's kind of my real quick overview of what happened in Kecksburg in 1965. Again, like I said, we do reference it quite often because it is it's a close example, and it's also, as Nick's going to kind of get into here, and I kind of hinted at a little bit, it's one that we see go from a thing that definitely happened, which is cool because a lot of, especially with UFO related things, there's not much evidence after the fact, and there's usually not a ton of witnesses. This one has a lot of witnesses, a lot of them going on the record, who are very credible, professional people. It's not just a bunch of randos. And I think that's kind of what gave it a lot of life initially. And 2, it has all the hallmarks of what we like in at least in America, what we like in a possible UFO crash. You have it landing in a rural area. You have the government coming in and taking something away, and an apparent cover-up, which leads to speculation. It ticks all those boxes. I think that's why it's so much fun and why we bring it up so often. And I think, Nick, you're going to now give us a little bit of what's happened since then, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I'll start off by saying it's self evident that something did happen over there. And there's been a lot of speculation about what that could be. Of course, you referenced Leslie Kean already, who has a Freedom of Information Act with NASA about all this. But I think that's a bit silly. I think that's more of a publicity thing. I'm not the only one who said as much, because here's the fact of the matter. NASA wouldn't have had anything to do with this and what the likely actual things are, because one, it's important to remember that NASA is a civilian thing. They are government funded, but it is a largely collaboration between civilian and private entities. And even within government things, there's not exactly communication between different agencies and whatnot. So you mentioned the Cosmos thing. I wanted to bring up another a couple things, but I'll get deeper into the Cosmos things. A lot of people who speculate that this could be some sort of government thing look to the Nazi Bell experiments, which I think is largely farcical. I didn't even really delve into that. The Cosmos thing is really interesting because the Soviet Cosmos 96, or 3MV4 number 6, was launched in November of 1965. It's my understanding that this was a low orbital satellite, or no, sorry, this was to do a bypass of Venus, supposedly. But upon launch, there was an issue with one of its jets, and it remained in a suborbital state for roughly 16 days, is what's stated. It never made it beyond lower orbit. The thing itself is very similar to an acorn in shape. You already mentioned Cyrillic alphabet, the distinctive alphabet with backwards R's and N's and a crown type thing that is, one of the more common alphabet systems.
It looks really
Eastern
cool
Europe.
too.
It
like
sure
cool,
does. It's
cool
also very
alphabet.
confusing.
I'm sure it is.
If you are familiar, because I've tried to learn Russian on several occasions, and I don't stick with it. There are some, what they call for Russian or Cyrillic language learners, there are friends, true friends, and those are the letters that look the same and sound the same. But then there are false friends, which are letters that look the same but sound very different. That's an aside. But again, things going in favor of that Cyrillic alphabet. For people in the United States, particularly rural United States, that might not see Russian writing, such as, in New York, there are Russian neighborhoods, especially in the early part of the 20th century. There were Russian neighborhoods in several larger cities. If you had never seen Cyrillic, you might look upon that as being hieroglyphic. I'm not totally sure if I buy that, just because out here in Western Pennsylvania, we have a lot, especially Westmoreland County has a lot of Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, and Ukrainian immigrants in that region. And even if these are their children or whatnot, they might have some familiarity with Cyrillic. You want to add something there?
Yeah, and I think that I agree with everything you just said there, and I'm always wary of an excuse that assumes regular people are dumb.
I like that attitude.
You know what I mean? So
I like your attitude. I know what you mean, but I can't dismiss the fact that if you had never seen Cyrillic before, you could look at that and say hieroglyphics. And that, yes. The other thing is that one statement could have been made by one person and just got repeated throughout all the literature that's grown up in the 50, 60 years since this whole incident. So I give that some credence. The Cyrillic writing that would be on a Soviet satellite, that checks with me with the stories that get passed from this. The acorn shape passes with me as well, because that's what everybody has described it as. But there's also some evidence that the Cosmos 96 crashed in Western Canada, Western Ontario specifically. There has been some disputes because, according to some things I've read, and I've gone to various government as well as civil engineer sites, as well as some aeronautical sites, they talk about trying to calculate these things is pretty tricky. There is evidence that on the same day, you kind of alluded to earlier, people throughout Canada, in at least across 8 different states, particularly Michigan and Ohio, they saw this thing light up. Basically your Lake Erie region, and different pieces of debris were recovered. But if you follow that trajectory could lead this to Western Pennsylvania. So Cosmos 96, I'm not ruling out, even though there have been some who have stated, like you mentioned earlier, that it was recovered mainly in Canada. Let me bring something new to you, though. Are you familiar with the Johnston Atoll?
I am not.
When I say atoll, what do you think of?
I mean, like an island.
Yeah, Bikini Atoll, where we did our atomic tests, the United States government, and there's all sorts of atolls out that way. I don't know if it's atoll or atoll, but
yeah, I'm sure there's a better geographic definition for it. But in my head, I'm like, is it a volcanic? is it a volcanic island? Maybe
that I am not prepared to say. But they're usually pretty small, mostly sandy, a little bit of vegetation. This all part of Micronesia, is my understanding. These are very isolated places, but Johnston Atoll, the very brief history of it, I mean, Americans have had some sort of claim on it since before the War of 1812. There's been some contact with America in this uninhabited island. During World War II, it was used as a way station for ships and planes. There's an airstrip that's been there, I think, since the mid-1930s. It's mostly been a military-occupied atoll. Today, it is monitored. Their migrating birds will stop there, but it is being monitored because we have a lot of very nasty things kind of being stored there, including Agent Orange and other nerve toxins and things like that. The airstrip is still there. They still fly in periodically, but it's my understanding that it being an active military site was closed in 93. But why do I bring this up? I bring this up because, again, we conducted a lot of rocket testing and a lot of further atomic testing from Johnston Atoll, including Program 437. Now, again, I was reading this off different military sites and engineering sites. Program 437 utilized Thor, I believe Atlas missiles as well, but mostly Thor missiles that were modified, having nuclear aspects. And what the plan was, and again, let's put ourselves in the time period. This is late 50s into 1970-75. So we are height of the Cold War.
Yep.
We are at the dawn of the space race. We got Telstar. We got Sputnik. We got all that jazz happening. The low orbit, the upper atmosphere, is just a hotbed right now. Let's talk about, the U-2 spy planes. There's all sorts of this new frontier in espionage. Basically, Project 437, to the best I can understand it, in the most succinct definition, it was using these modified Thor missiles with nuclear aspect. The idea was that they would go up into lower orbit and disrupt, through exploding in lower orbit, enemy satellite. That program continued to evolve a little bit, because one of the issues with that is if you detonate up in a lower orbit like that, it's just going to indiscriminately take out satellites. It was just too difficult to kind of pinpoint. So, of course, they're trying to and experimenting with all this while keeping an eye on the Soviets, and the Soviets mutual exchange of this. They're watching us, and so everything's having to be very secret. Okay, there was a side project to Project 437. It was, what was it called? It was an alternative payload. So it was Project 437 AP. What this project was, took that idea, utilizing the Thor missiles, but it had a camera operations, and the idea was it would pass targeted satellites, and Soviet satellites, photograph them, a monitoring system. This also had some nuclear aspect, is my understanding, and there was a return capsule on these. We know for a fact too that one of these Thor missiles was launched on December 7th, 1965. So if you're keeping score, Soviet's Cosmos 96, which a lot of people traditionally have looked to, was launched on November 16th, 1965. So probability is very much there. Our Thor missile, though, with Project 437 AP was launched on December 7th. We would launch these December 7th through July 2nd, 1966. So those cameras, like I said, had recovery capsules. They ceased this program in November 30th of 1966. And the whole thing, all these doctored Thor missile for satellite purposes conclude November 6, 1975. Okay. Let's explore this Thor missile a little bit more. Launched December 7th, 1965. That return capsule had all the camera equipment as well, and likely it had some sort of radioactive element going on. This is alluded to in all the documentation I could find, all the credible sources I could find. That return capsule has 4 jets on it in order to control its descent, in order to target a little bit too. Of course, being the dawn of all this space stuff, this isn't always the most accurate thing. It goes up. Its whole purpose is to focus on those low orbit satellites, recover as much information as possible, photograph them, come back down. And there is some suggestion that what may have been recovered at Kecksburg was the result of this Project 437 AP December 7th launch. As probable to me as a Soviet thing, because here's the other things I want to point out. If this wasn't a military thing, how were members of the military able to be there within a fairly short time of it landing? You had mentioned, and all the supposed eyewitnesses state that there were people wearing radioactive suits, which would make sense if this capsule had like a nuclear and atomic element of some kind that could be emitting radiation. I don't know how that wouldn't affect camera, but that's a question for you, but hold up there. So these are some of the things I've thought about. There's also the fact that some early retellings, when locals were asked about the whole incident, state that while there were some military uniform presence, to the extent that it's reported later on, has been widely overblown, such as commandeering houses and everything. Apparently, that wasn't really the case. Some people in that region say. Lastly, and this is just more of a general question that I pose to you about supposed alien crafts in general, I believe that this is quite likely a Soviet satellite that crashed, or one of our own spy satellites, effectively, that's come down and we're trying to retrieve the information. Both of these scenarios, the government would have been tracking these projectiles. Both of these things, the government would be very desirous to keep a tight lid on. And also, we know that the United States government and the Soviets were stealing things from one another. And we know, I read somewhere about how U.S. agents, there was like a Soviet tour of their technology, specific to a heat shield as it went through Mexico. We actually took that, and it, so a mutual exchange of ideas in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right. But bottom line, whether this is a Soviet satellite crash, whether this is one of our spy satellite return capsules landing, government's going to be there pretty quick. They're going to be very tight-lipped about it, and for understandable reasons that might not have come out Of course, there's that freedom of information thing. I think it's targeting the wrong source. It should be targeting the American military-industrial complex, but I don't think that's the real point. I think that's more of a show thing. If we go out to recover our stuff like that, here's my general question that took me forever to get to. How come whenever there's an alien crash and there's so many aliens out there and there's so many UFOs out there, how come they never send anybody down to recover their stuff?
My answer is because they're pure modes of consciousness. I don't believe that in the physical craft theory. But if we're saying, hey, there are physical craft, they are extraterrestrial in the sense that they are coming from other planets, they have people in them. I'm not sure if we've talked about this or not, but I have the theory that people say, oh, well, we recover alien stuff from Roswell or wherever, and then we reverse engineer it into other things. Was that us talking
You're right.
about that?
We did talk. You and I talked about this, and you made the great point that I've always thought too, but never put into words. That, like, if you went, this was the example you used. If we went to Leonardo da Vinci, you said, and we gave him like a smartphone, he might be able to figure out some things of it, but it's just so far removed that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Was that on a Ghost Furnace episode? Or was that just us talking?
That might have been while we were getting ready to hit record or immediately afterwards.
So
I think it may have been in reference to preparing to do this.
Oh, really? Okay.
But we might go back and listen to ourselves and be like, oh, we're idiots.
Oh, we were way off.
Record all that.
But yeah, but just for those, if I've said this before or if I haven't said it before, yes to what you're saying, Nick. I think that the idea of reverse engineering alien spacecraft into something we can use doesn't pass the eye test, in the sense that it would be the engineering elements that would be needed and used, and the mathematical and scientific components that would be being utilized are so far advanced. If that's the way they're getting here and what they're doing, like, obviously we would be interested in them, from like a material standpoint, but it's not like we're going to get an alien spacecraft and turn and be able to be like, oh, in 10 years we'll have our own version of this thing. I agree. I think that's reasonable.
I agree with you. I don't doubt if that were a real thing that we couldn't learn something from it, but to recreate the technology entirely.
Yeah, and if I was an extraterrestrial, going somewhere else, I'd probably use that principle to be like, okay, well, if we lose a probe or something like that, if there's nothing harmful in it, then it's like, oh, we littered, kind of thing. It's not going to do anything. So that's why I don't think they necessarily have a moral obligation to recover anything. Now, if there's, like with Roswell and other places where people say, oh, there was aliens, again, I think probably not. I think, look at how often we use drones nowadays, that if that's a theory you're going with, why in the world would they risk their own lives for it, unless they're on like people use the theory that this is just a stop on a galactic safari. That's literally for entertainment's sake is the only thing I can think of as far as making it rational. Yeah. So to answer your question, that's why I don't think that they're worried about getting their busted up craft.
Fair enough. But what about their busted up people? Again, we're making a lot of assumptions here.
A lot of assumptions
because, again, I completely agree with you about the reverse engineering thing, especially with the example that you brought up the last time we were together. You used Da Vinci because, the height of the Renaissance man, and I think the phrase you used was probably your most engineering-minded person of his era. Mm-hmm. And I agree with all of that. One thing I will say, though, is like you kind of said earlier, I like working under people aren't stupid. What if it were a craft, but we're closer to the technology than we realize?
I mean, that's possible. Maybe. Yeah. Let's say that this culture, let's say it is a culture and they're aliens and everything, making those presumptions. Yeah. Let's say they're only 200 years in advance of us, which would be like remarkable. But yeah, from an engineering standpoint, 200 years is, I bet I could give I bet I could give Thomas Edison a smartphone and he would probably get further than Galileo or Da Vinci.
Yeah, because he's starting from a further place. I
exactly.
agree with that too.
So maybe there is a case where aliens do come back to pick up their busted up junk. But I mean, you see it all the time. A car breaks down in the middle of a Target parking lot, and people are just, like, yeah, well, that's someone else's problem now.
Now, that's the sort of thing I'd expect to see at a Hills, but a Target, no. And one thing we talked about, this incident here got a lot of people who were kids at the time in this immediate region really into this. And of course, that the biggest of those is probably Stan Gordon, who we only have positive feelings for. I lead by saying that. Again, I am not the person to break the idea that Cosmos 96 or even this Project 437 business could be directly related to everything that happened over at Kecksburg. But I know a lot of people in that whole UFO community are pretty torn on this. A lot of people think, it's pretty well, there's pretty good evidence that these two things I bring up, these two scenarios in particular, are completely plausible. They check all these boxes.
Yeah.
And, but there's some like Stan Gordon who's very quick to say there's no way. And I feel this way for a couple reasons. I think one of the things he cited was that, well, what about that writing? Well, have you ever looked at a diagram for a thermionic valve? Because I have, and I understand that's a whole bunch of symbology that isn't going to mean much to a lay person. But there's also another thing. Before we started recording tonight, I said that there has been additional books by an author pertaining to a series that I had really liked when I was in my teens. Mm-hmm. I don't want to read these newer books, though, because I don't want them to damage my feelings about those books that I enjoyed as a teenager. I think that, and I am sympathetic to Stan Gordon saying this is in no way this satellite return capsule. And I think a lot of that is because this was kind of the navel of a lot of what he's known for, and it happened. It's a passion thing for him. Mm-hmm. And, I'm just going to leave that at that.
I think for him, it seems like, this is me kind of projecting a little bit, so I don't want to say that.
I did the same thing, in fairness.
With how he writes on his website and everything, I think he honestly wants to just get to the bottom one way or the other. Like a lot of folks who deal in the paranormal, I think he believes a lot of the witnesses. He believes what they saw. And I think his reverence for the people and for the want to just kind of like figure out what happened, I think you see that play out in the rest of his books, especially in Silent Invasion, which, if you read Silent Invasion just to a T, it's just a series of incidences that his group was let in on and investigated. But if you kind of like read between the lines, it's kind of him saying, hey, I'm not saying that UFOs and Bigfoot are the same thing, but I'm saying there's a correlation between Bigfoot sighting flaps and UFO sighting flaps at this area in this time.
And I agree with that, and I'm not meaning to pick on Stan Gordon. I said, that whole community is very torn on this.
So, yeah.
And I do think that there are just too many people that do have an emotional thing to this.
Yes.
And that's understandable, especially if it was such an eventful thing in your life. And it's also this. I mean, the guy loves the people in his community because, as you say, this is his backyard. And there are people that have been turning to him and turning to others. And it is a community. And it's hard to turn to people that you care about and you have a feeling for and say, hey, I know this is what you thought you saw, but this is way more likely. That's not hard to do because it's like turning to somebody and saying, you're wrong.
No, yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying there. And I think that one of the things that makes it hard is something we go back to, I know I harp on a lot, is the idea of being correct about these things versus what they might be. Now, here's the thing: is if you said a U.S. military or a Russian craft of some sort that was experimental crashed in Kecksburg in 1965, that's still pretty interesting. That's an important
100%.
That's a really important part of both countries' histories and everything in that case. Who knows what that led to and what came out of that. You get caught up in what you think it is and what you want it to be, and you lose sight of the merit of the other options just because it's not what you initially kind of thought, or the disappointment around being incorrect or things of that nature.
And I can't help but think that a lot of people at that time felt that this had certainly something to do with the military and specifically with the Soviets, because that had to be on a lot of people's minds. I mean, it's less than right. Sputnik was what, 1958?
Yeah, not long before, not even a decade.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and of course, the space race is in full heat. We are post-Kennedy now. We are 4 years from landing on the moon. I mean, and again, we are at the height of the Cold War. I completely agree with you. Isn't it fantastical enough? I just want to know, where did it being a UFO one thing, alien something else, and a lot of people, when did that start? Because I don't know if that would have been, I don't know, maybe it would have been on a lot of people's mind at that moment.
I mean, I think it was probably on people's mind just because this is post Roswell. This is I believe this is post Battle of Los Angeles. I believe this is post the stuff around Mount Washington and Shasta and stuff like that. So, I mean, but 1965 UFOs would have been well within the zeitgeist, I think.
Here's something I do want to throw out, and I apologize. I feel like I'm interrupting your thought here.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
But I think we take it for granted that we say things like Roswell. We say slightly lesser known things like Battle of Los Angeles. I wonder how many people who weren't reading periodicals that address these things were really aware of these. We live in such media saturation, where back then you had periodicals, you had radio, television was really getting it full legs, but the programming and we can cater to a specific interest in a way we've been able to for the past 30-some years that you couldn't in 1965 so easily. So I do wonder, how well known was Roswell? Was that really the household thing that we take it to be today?
No, that's a good point. I'm actually looking up right now when the first UFO movie was.
Well, I think of
because I honestly don't know.
Robot with the red eyes. Gosh, I mean, we've had movies. I mean, Georges Millet had Le Voyage de la Lune. That was 1898, I think. But modern space aliens coming down,
but I don't know. I really don't. I don't have a great answer to that. That's a really good point.
Flying saucers, UFOs are one thing, but an intimate familiarity with quote credible, things is another one. I guess that's where I'm going with it.
You had in the papers the next day, in Pittsburgh and in Greensburg and in Latrobe, bringing up meteors along with UFOs. I think that's something we should really look into more.
I honestly don't.
The article headlines. Let me see if I can find some that I pulled up from just one of my sources that I was looking at. For instance, in the front page of the Greenberg Tribune Review the next day on December 10th, ran the headlines: unidentified flying object falls near Kecksburg, and Army ropes off area. Searchers fail to find fallen object. So they use unidentified flying object, but they don't say UFO/alien by any stretch. Now, that being said, I'm gonna send this page over to you so you can find the actual newspaper article, hopefully. But yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that's a really good point to bring up.
I'm pulling up my newspaper archive right now.
Okay,
so
cool.
This might maybe timestamp this real quick. Okay, so that whole question got us down a rabbit hole. We actually went through some of our newspaper archives, and we looked at I looked at two different newspapers. Brendan, you looked
I was looking at a few. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's what we concluded. We were looking at both. I looked at one December 9th to see if a late edition would have something. No such luck. We were obviously looking at December 10th. I even looked at December 11th. Nothing. The one and only thing that we could find came from the Pittsburgh Press, December 10th. It had an astronomer from the Allegheny Observatory basically said that the flash in the sky last night could have been a meteorite. The only thing we can conclude from the past 20 minutes that we spared you from is that, one, I didn't realize the Family Circus had been in publication in 1965, and I did not know that we can safely say it has not been funny even in 1965. Conclusively.
Because the thing is I just kind of, again, this is where we talk about assumptions. I always thought me not thinking the Family Circus is funny was like a cultural or it was some kind of like generational gap. But after me and you reviewed multiple Family Circuses from 1965, the fact that this is what they were printing back then, it was really, really telling. That's the most
the hard take.
Yeah,
we're gonna make a hard take here, and that is Family Circus. Sorry, no.
It's just not good.
I think Mark Trail's funnier.
Well, Mark Trail's definitely funnier. But so to kind of wrap things up, I hope we have done a decent job. I'm going to keep looking actually to try and find that Kecksburg, that Greensburg Tribune Review paper.
We're going to look for more contemporary articles.
Yeah.
If you want to email us though and tell us or share with us a funny Family Circus as a counter argument, how can people do that?
If you have a counter argument, a funny Family Circus article, or if you find this newspaper article before we do, or any feedback or any story, you can find us both at Facebook and Instagram at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or you can just email us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.